The stars had never looked so cold. Captain Alara Juno stood at the bridge of the UEDF warship Helios, her sharp gaze fixed on the expanse of darkness beyond. Her heart beat in measured cadence, like a soldier's drum. But something within her stirred, a sense of unease. The vastness of the universe had always been a constant reminder of humanity's insignificance, but now it felt different. It felt like they were no longer just explorers, but prey. The Helios had been en route for days, following a faint distress signal from a human colony on the fringe of Earth's territory. The Akarni, a species few dared speak of in whispers, had begun to make their presence known. At first there had been rumors, small skirmishes with frontier colonies, a few unprovoked attacks, but nothing definitive. Until now. Alara's eyes flicked to the large screen on the bridge displaying a holographic map of the surrounding star system. The colony was located on a small, barren moon in the Talos system, a place no one in their right mind would choose for a settlement. Yet humanity, ever driven to conquer, had done just that. And now it seemed that boldness had cost them. "Captain," a voice broke through the silence. It was Commander Thorne, her second in command, his voice tight with urgency. "We've arrived. At the outer orbit, still no response from the colony. It's dead silent." Dead silent. The words hung in the air, a heavy weight that pressed on Ilara's chest. Silence in space was never good. And silence when you were dealing with the Akarni, it was worse than a death sentence. "We proceed as planned," Ilara said, her voice firm, the calm of a woman who had faced the end of the universe more than once. "Prepare a recon team. We're not leaving until we know what happened." Thorne hesitated. "What if it's a trap, Captain? We don't know what we're walking into." She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. His words were sharp, but there was fear. Underneath them, fear she hadn't seen in him before. Ilara could understand it. The Akarni were known for their brutal tactics, leaving no survivors. Their technology was far beyond anything humanity had developed, but there was no turning back now. "We walk into the unknown, Commander. That's what we do. Every single day." The ship's engines hummed with power as Helios glided silently toward the moon, its sleek, angular hull a symbol of humanity's might and ambition. Yet even the ship's formidable strength felt fragile against the backdrop of the universe's emptiness. The moon loomed ahead, a dull gray sphere as lifeless and cold as the void around it. As the ship descended into the colony's atmosphere, Ilara's mind wandered to the countless times she had stood on this bridge, looking out at the stars. Her thoughts were always the same: wonder, awe, and a quiet, unspoken resolve. Humanity was here to stay. They had carved their place in the universe with blood, sweat, and the determination to never be pushed back. But this time, something was different. The shuttle bay doors opened and a squad of UEDF Marines, their armor gleaming under the harsh lights of the ship, moved into position. They were the best humanity had to offer, trained to endure the worst, to face the unimaginable. Yet even they couldn't hide the tension in their movements. They were about to confront something humanity had never fully understood. Ilara led the way into the shuttle. The cold steel walls of the ship seemed to close in on her, pressing down, reminding her of the weight of command. The rest of the crew followed, their footsteps echoing with quiet determination. They knew their mission, and they knew the stakes. As the shuttle's thrusters powered up, Ilara's thoughts drifted back to Earth, her home. A planet teeming with life, humanity's cradle. But this far out, Earth felt so distant, so fragile. Here, in the cold expanse of space, no one cared whether you were human or alien. All that mattered was survival. The descent was swift. The shuttle's engines rumbled as it pierced the atmosphere of the moon, the surface below quickly becoming visible. Ilara's gaze sharpened as they neared the colony's site. The once thriving settlement now appeared abandoned, its buildings silent, their windows dark. A faint, acrid smoke lingered in the air, the remains of something that had burned. "Prepare to land," Ilara ordered, her voice steady. The shuttle touched down with a slight jolt. As the hatch opened, Ilara was the first to step out onto the cracked, lifeless soil. The air was thin, the horizon bleak, nothing moved. It felt wrong. Thorn was next to her, his hand resting on his rifle, scanning the surroundings. No signs of life, Captain. Nothing. It's like they just vanished. Ilara clenched her fists, a cold fire igniting within her. The Akarni were notorious for their scorched earth tactics, obliterating anything in their path. Yet this was different. There was something deliberate about the destruction here. A message, perhaps, or a warning. They moved quickly, covering the ruins of the colony. Broken equipment, scorched metal, and shattered glass littered the ground. It didn't take long for them to find the first body, a young civilian, her face frozen. In terror, her body burned beyond recognition. It was clear the Akarni had been here, but the question that burned in Ilara's mind was, why? As they continued through the wreckage, Ilara's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sharp cry, a sound so alien that it made her blood run cold. The crew froze, their weapons drawn. The sound came again, echoing through the empty streets, followed by the unmistakable hum of Akarni war machines. They were not alone. Ilara's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She had expected the worst, but nothing could prepare her for what she was about to face. The Akarni had arrived, and this time they were ready. But so was humanity. The sound of war machines echoed through the barren streets of the colony, a rhythmic hum that vibrated in Ilara's bones. It wasn't the rumble of engines she had expected. It was deeper, more unsettling. Like something ancient, something that had been lying dormant, now awakened with a thirst for destruction. Ilara's grip tightened on her pulse rifle. The Marines, clustered around her, shared a look of grim determination. They had trained for moments like this, though nothing could have prepared them for the sheer terror the Akarni inspired. The air around them seemed to hum with an alien energy, a palpable sense of dread that crawled under their skin. "They're close," Thorn muttered, his voice tight. Ilara nodded, her mind racing. She couldn't afford to hesitate. "We move now, stay sharp." They advanced, the ruins of the colony providing little cover as they pressed forward. The smell of burning debris clung to the air, and the dust kicked up with every step, stinging their eyes. As they rounded the corner of a crumbled building, Ilara froze. There, ahead of them, stood a figure, tall, imposing, its dark silhouette like a shadow against the decimated skyline. It wasn't human. The Akarni were a terrifying sight, taller than any human by at least a foot, their elongated limbs covered in thick chitinous plating. Their faces were alien and almost insectoid, with compound eyes that gleamed with cold intelligence. Yet it was their presence, intangible yet overpowering, that made them so terrifying. Even standing still, they radiated an aura of lethal authority. And this one wasn't alone. A dozen more appeared from the shadows, their sleek forms moving, with unsettling precision. They didn't speak, not in a language Ilara could understand, but there was no mistaking their intent. The Akarni had arrived, and they were here for one thing: destruction. "Take cover!" Ilara shouted, diving behind the wreckage of a nearby generator. The Marines followed suit, their weapons raised, but the Akarni were faster. The air around them seemed to warp as their weapons powered up, strange energy cannons that crackled with unearthly force. The first shot rang out. The energy blast collided with the building to Ilara's left, sending a shockwave through the ground. She barely managed to stay on her feet as debris rained down. The Marines fired back in unison, their shots sparking against the Akarni's armor, but it was like hitting a wall of steel. Their weapons were ineffective. The Akarni didn't flinch. "Damn it," Thorn cursed. "We're outmatched. We need to fall back. Now." But Ilara couldn't bring herself to retreat. Not yet. Not while humanity was teetering on the brink of extinction. The UEDF had always been the shield against the darkness of the universe, and this was no different. She wasn't about to let the Akarni take this colony without a fight. "Hold your ground," Ilara barked, taking aim and firing at one of the Akarni's advancing positions. Her shot found its mark, but the alien merely absorbed the impact and advanced. Ilara's heart sank. This wasn't going to be a battle of firepower. It was going to be a battle of will. The Akarni leader stepped forward, towering over them like a judge condemning humanity to oblivion. Its eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the squad as if weighing their worth. Then it spoke, its voice low and guttural, vibrating in Ilara's chest like a distant thunderstorm. "Your species is weak. You defy the inevitable, the Akarni," Commander intoned, its voice amplified by the strange mechanical device strapped to its chest. "You will surrender or perish." Ilara's pulse quickened. There was a strange chill in the air as the words sunk in. The Akarni were no mere invaders. They were conquerors, and they were used to getting what they wanted. "Not today," Ilara replied, her voice steady despite the rising terror in her chest. "You'll have to kill us all first." The Akarni commander tilted its head slightly, as if considering her words. Then, without warning, it raised its arm, and the air crackled with energy. A blinding beam shot toward them. Time seemed to slow. Ilara's heart stopped for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, she saw the unmistakable spark of humanity's tenacity. She threw herself forward, tackling Thorn to the ground just as the beam blasted the space where they had been standing moments before. The explosion reverberated in her chest, and she felt the heat sear her skin as debris showered around them. "Move," Ilara shouted, pulling Thorn to his feet. "We need to get to the transport ship now." But the Akarni weren't letting them go that easily. They were closing in, and fast. Ilara's mind raced. There was no way they could outrun these machines, but she wasn't about to go down without a plan. "Set the charges," Ilara ordered, voice grim. "We're going to make sure they don't leave here unscathed." Thorn gave her a look, his face pale but resolute. "Are you sure? We can't hold them off for long." "We don't have a choice," she snapped. "We fight, or we die." The Marines moved quickly, setting explosive charges at key locations around the colony. Ilara took up a position near the transport, her rifle aimed at the advancing Akarni. There was no fear in her now, just a cold, fierce resolve. These creatures had made a grave mistake. Humanity might be outmatched in technology, but they were not easily broken. They would fight until their last breath. The Akarni were getting closer now. The explosions had taken out a few of their patrols, but the bulk of their force was still coming. Ilara clenched her jaw, her hand steady on the rifle. She would not let them take Earth. She would not let humanity fall. The charges went off in a brilliant flash of light, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The Akarni leader staggered, but its soldiers kept advancing. And that's when Ilara saw it. A single moment, a single opening, the flicker of uncertainty in the leader's eyes. Without thinking, she sprinted toward it. Her soldiers followed, a blur of motion as they charged the Akarni lines. This was their last stand. They were going to make the invaders regret ever setting foot on human soil. The shockwave from the explosions echoed across the barren moon like the death knell of a civilization. Dust and smoke hung in the air, swirling around the ruins of the colony as Ilara and her squad sprinted through the haze. Every footfall felt heavy, as if the very ground beneath them was reluctant to bear their weight. The Akarni were not just invaders. They were a force of nature, and Ilara felt it with every pulse of her heart. "Keep moving," Ilara barked, her voice barely cutting through the chaos. She could feel the heat of the blast on her skin, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins drowned out the pain. "We're almost at the transport." Her Marines were scattered around her, their faces tight with focus, rifles raised and ready. They moved like a well-oiled machine despite the overwhelming odds. Ilara could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear she felt, but they did not waver. They had all chosen this life, this mission, and they would not back down now. But the Akarni were relentless. Their leader had staggered, but the rest of the invaders didn't flinch. They were closing in, their movements eerie in their precision, the alien energy weapons humming in the air like a constant threat. And in the midst of the chaos, Ilara felt a horrible truth settling deep in her bones. The Akarni weren't just after the colony. They were after humanity itself. As they reached the transport ship, Ilara's heart skipped a beat. The Akarni were already there, their imposing figures standing between the crew and their only means of escape. Ilara's mind raced. There was no way they could win this fight. Not in the open. "Fall back!" Ilara shouted. But she was already pulling Thorn behind her as they ducked behind a pile of wreckage. The air around them vibrated with the force of the Akarni's weaponry. The ground cracked underfoot as the invaders advanced. Thorn's voice was tight with anger. "We can't outrun them, Captain. We need a plan. Now." Ilara's mind spun. There was no time for a tactical retreat. The transport had already been damaged by the explosions, its systems flickering as if the ship itself was dying. Their only hope was to destroy enough of the Akarni forces to buy them time. But how? How could they fight against an enemy so far beyond them? That's when she saw it. An Akarni transport, half hidden behind a charred building. Its engines, dark. It wasn't the largest of their war machines, but it was large enough to hold a squad and armed to the teeth with advanced weaponry. A small window of opportunity. If they could capture it, they could at least escape. "Ilara, you're not thinking straight," Thorn said as if reading her mind. "That ship is—" "I'm thinking we don't have another choice," she cut him off, her voice sharp. "We either fight for our survival or we die here." Thorn hesitated, his brow furrowed, with doubt. But he trusted her. They all did. Without another word, he motioned for the squad to follow, and they began moving toward the Akarni transport. As they advanced through the rubble, their footsteps were masked by the sounds of the Akarni's advance, heavy footsteps that resonated like distant thunder, each one a reminder of their impending doom. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of the decision hanging over them. They reached the transport, its hull slick with alien material, a design so sleek it looked like it had been carved from the stars themselves. The Marines planted explosive charges on the sides, silently preparing to disable the Akarni ship. The plan was simple: plant the explosives, create a distraction, board the ship, and take control. But that's when they saw it. The leader. The Akarni commander was standing at the far end of the ruins observing them. Its eyes locked with Ilara's across the wreckage, and for a split second, Ilara could swear it was smiling. A cruel, hollow expression. "Time to see if humanity truly lives up to its reputation," Ilara murmured to herself, her fingers tightening around her rifle. She had no idea how the next few moments would unfold, but she knew this was their last chance. Single shot rang out from the Akarni leader, its weapon firing in an instant. Ilara dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast. The Marines scattered, opening fire as they returned to cover, but their weapons didn't even seem to faze the leader. It was like fighting a storm. "We need that ship now," Ilara shouted, adrenaline surging. The Marines planted the final charges and sprinted toward the transport. As the explosives detonated, the Akarni forces staggered, momentarily thrown off balance. It was their chance. "Ilara!" Thorn shouted, his voice urgent. "The leader's coming." Ilara didn't need to be told twice. She ran toward the Akarni transport, leaping over the debris, her heart hammering in her chest. Behind her, the sounds of battle intensified. Her squad was holding their ground, but the odds were overwhelming. With one final push, Ilara reached the transport's hatch. She slammed her hand on the interface, praying the ship's systems would recognize her clearance codes. The hatch hissed open, and she ducked inside, signaling for the Marines to follow. But just as they were about to board, a blast of energy ripped through the air, striking the transport's wing. The ship jerked violently, the controls flashing red. The Akarni were no longer playing games. They were determined to end this now. "Get in, now!" Ilara shouted, pushing the Marines inside. She was the last to board, slamming the hatch shut behind her. The transport's engines roared to life, its artificial gravity locking in as the ship lurched upward, shaking as it broke free from the colony's surface. Ilara glanced out the viewport as the colony's broken, smoke-filled landscape began to fade. The Akarni weren't finished yet, though. They would come after them. They always came after their prey. But as the transport hurtled into space, Ilara looked at her crew, her Marines. There was fear in their eyes, but there was also something else. Defiance. They were alive. And humanity had a fighting chance. The stars outside the viewport were cold, distant points of light, indifferent to the struggle unfolding inside the ship. The Akarni warship loomed in the distance, far beyond the colony's decimated remains, its engines glowing with an eerie green light. The hum of the transport's engines was a steady pulse in the quiet of the cockpit, but the silence inside the ship felt deafening. They had escaped, but only just. Ilara stared at the display in front of her, watching as the transport's hull registered damage. She could hear the crew members in the back trying to stabilize the ship's core systems, but the damage was extensive. They weren't out of danger yet, not by a long shot. "We've got incoming." Thorne's voice crackled through her earpiece. Akarni ships fast and closing in. Ilara's eyes narrowed. She had expected as much. The Akarni would never let them slip away so easily. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Ilara ordered, her voice cold with determination. "And power up the weapons. We're not running from this." The ship lurched as she hit the thrusters, sending them into a sharp dive. The Akarni ships were fast, far faster than they should have been, their sleek black forms cutting through the vacuum of space like predators in the dark. A streak of red light sliced through the space in front of them, laser fire from the enemy ships narrowly missing the transport. Ilara's hands flew over the controls. They were barely in range of their weapon systems, but she fired anyway. The weapons on the transport were crude compared to the Akarni's, but they still packed a punch. A beam of energy shot out, striking one of the Akarni ships. It flared up in a brilliant explosion, but the damage was minimal. The enemy wasn't phased. "Damn it," Thorne muttered. "We need a miracle, Ilara." "You don't get it," Ilara growled, her eyes locked on the display. "We are the miracle." Before anyone could respond, the ship's comms buzzed. A chilling voice echoed through the cockpit so cold it sent a shiver down Ilara's spine. "You are not the first to defy us, human." The Akarni leader's voice filled the space, its tone like ice. "But you will be the first to fall." Ilara gripped the controls tighter. The leader had tracked them, she knew it. This wasn't just a chase anymore, this was a test. And the Akarni were eager to see how far humanity would go before it broke. "We've got no choice," Ilara said, her voice steady but fierce. "All systems to full power. We're taking this fight to them." Thorne stared at her, wide-eyed. "Are you insane? We're outgunned, outclassed. That warship will tear us apart." "We're not running. We're fighting." Ilara's gaze hardened. "Do you think humanity survived this long by running, Thorne? We fight. We never stop. Fighting." The room was quiet for a heartbeat. The crew knew she was right. The UEDF didn't retreat. They fought to the bitter end. And if this was their end, then they would make sure it wasn't easy for the Akarni. The transport shuddered as it accelerated, darting toward the Akarni warship, which loomed larger on their screen with every passing second. The rest of the squad braced for impact, checking their gear, tightening their grips on their weapons. The countdown to their final stand had begun. The Akarni fired, and the entire ship jolted as a blast of energy slammed into their shields. The lights flickered, and Ilara's heart skipped a beat as the ship's hull groaned under the assault. The shields held, barely. "Engage, evasive. Now!" Ilara shouted, slamming the transport into a sudden roll. The ship spiraled, evading. Another shot, but the Akarni were relentless, their fire coming fast and furious. The hull cracked again, and the warning lights flashed in the cockpit signaling imminent breach. "You cannot win." The Akarni leader's voice echoed through the comms again, this time with a hint of amusement. "Your resistance is futile." Ilara's lip curled into a smile. The Akarni didn't understand. Humanity had faced extinction before and survived. This fight, this defiance, it was in their blood. "I'd say you're wrong, but I'd prefer to show you," Ilara muttered, flipping a switch. With a series of mechanical whirs, the ship's secondary weapons came online. It was a last-ditch effort, an experimental design a few years off from full deployment. They weren't supposed to be operational, But Alara had pushed every connection, every protocol to the limit. Now, they had only one shot. The transport leveled out, and Alara aimed directly for the Akarni warship's vulnerable underbelly. The entire crew held their breath as she pulled the trigger. A massive pulse of energy erupted from the transport's weapon systems, a beam so bright it cut through the darkness of space like a comet. The shot hit the Akarni warship dead center. For a moment, everything was still. Then the warship's engines flared and the ship cracked open, a massive explosion tearing it apart from the inside. The Akarni leader's final, horrified, scream echoed through the comms before it was abruptly cut off. But the fight wasn't over. The remaining Akarni ships scattered in all directions, some attempting to retreat, others circling to regroup. Ilara's breath came in ragged gasps, her hand still tight on the controls. The transport was damaged beyond repair, but they had survived. They had won. "Get to the escape pods," Ilara said, her voice hoarse but resolute. "We can't stay here." Thorn glanced back at her. "We're not done yet, are we?" "No," Ilara replied, looking out at the wreckage of the Akarni warship, a gleam of determination in her eyes. "But we've just sent them a message." The transport drifted through the debris field, the remnants of the Akarni warship scattered like the broken bones of a giant. The silence in the cockpit was profound, almost oppressive. The hum of the ship's failing systems and the faint beeping of alarms were the only sounds. Outside, the stars seemed as distant as ever, indifferent to the chaos they had just witnessed. Ilara's hands trembled on the controls, though she kept them steady. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. But she could not afford to rest, not yet. The war was far from over. "We made it," Thorn said quietly, his voice strained. But there was a trace of relief there. He was leaning against the bulkhead, his armor scratched and scorched, his face drawn with fatigue. "We actually did it." Ilara didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on the view ahead, on the dark void of space where the Akarni fleet had once loomed. But now the vast emptiness stretched before them, unclaimed, untamed, and yet teeming with possibilities. Humanity had just staked its claim in the stars. It was a victory, but it was only one battle in a much larger war. "We made it," she repeated finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we've only delayed the inevitable." Her words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. The Akarni had suffered a loss, but they weren't the type to retreat forever. They would rebuild, adapt, and return. They always did. "We've got a few hours before they track us," Thorn said, his tone shifting to pragmatism. "We can get to the nearest star base, get reinforcements." "No," Ilara interrupted, her voice sharp. She turned toward him, her expression steely. "We need to keep moving. The Akarni will never stop coming for us, for Earth. If we don't take the fight to them, we'll lose. We need to find their command fleet. Now." Thorn blinked, surprised. "You're talking about going back into the heart of their fleet after all this?" "Yes," Ilara replied firmly. "We've shown them what we're capable of. Now we have to finish this. We've got the element of surprise, and that's not something we'll get again. We take their leadership down. We end this before it starts spreading again." A long silence passed between them. Thorn looked down at his hands, the weight of her words sinking in. They had just faced down a force unlike anything humanity had ever encountered, and yet Ilara was already planning the next phase of the war. But then he met her gaze, and the determination in her eyes stirred something inside him. He knew she was right. There was no turning back now. "We're in this together," he said quietly, his voice resolute. "Whatever it takes." Ilara nodded, a rare, small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The fight was far from over, but she could feel the spark of hope flicker within her. Humanity wasn't done yet. The rest of the crew began filtering into the cockpit, all weary but alive, their eyes carrying the same grim determination. They weren't just survivors anymore, they were warriors forged in the fire of their enemy's wrath, and they had no intention of going quietly. "Prepare for warp," Ilara ordered, voice steady. "We're Going to find the Icarni command fleet, and when we do, we'll make sure they know who they're dealing with. As the transport's engines flared to life, propelling them into the cold vastness of space, Ilara stared out at the stars, her thoughts heavy. The battle had been won, but the war was just beginning. Humanity had faced its darkest hour and survived. But now they would need to find something even greater: unity, resolve, and the willingness to face the unknown. They would fight for their future, for their home, and they would not rest until the Icarni understood. You do not mess with humanity. The transport was silent, drifting through the stars like a ghost in the void. Ilara sat alone in the cockpit, her fingers lightly resting on the console, her gaze fixed on the swirling darkness beyond the viewport. The weight of what had just happened, what they had done, hung heavy on her shoulders. They had taken the fight to the Icarni, delivered a blow that would resonate throughout their fleet. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Far off in the distance, a tiny blip appeared on the radar. It was faint, barely detectable, but it was there. A ship, or perhaps something else. Ilara leaned forward, eyes narrowing as she focused in on the signal. She felt a shiver run down her spine. "Thorn," she called softly, turning to the comms. "Get in here." Thorn was at her side in moments, his face still weary but alert. "What is it?" "Something's coming. Something big." He glanced at the screen, then back at her, brow furrowed. "Icarni reinforcements?" "No, not quite," Ilara murmured. "This doesn't feel like them, but it's definitely not just a stray ship." The radar pinged again, the signal growing stronger, closer. And then, without warning, a shape emerged from the blackness, its contours barely visible, but unmistakable. It was a ship, an alien ship, but not like the Icarni. It was massive, the size of a moon, its hull shimmering with strange iridescent light. Its surface seemed to pulse, like it was alive, breathing in the cold vacuum of space. And it wasn't alone. Hundreds of smaller ships flanked it, like a swarm of insects surrounding their queen. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. "This was no Icarni fleet. What the hell is that?" Thorn whispered, his voice full of awe and trepidation. Before Ilara could respond, the ship's comms came alive with a deep, resonant voice, one that sent a chill down her spine. "Humanity. We have been watching." The voice echoed through the ship's systems, strange and alien, yet somehow familiar. "Your bravery has not gone unnoticed. You have earned our attention." Ilara's pulse quickened. Who were these beings, and why were they speaking to them now? The voice continued, its tone both enigmatic and foreboding. "You have stirred something ancient, something that was waiting. This war is far from over. In fact, it has only just begun." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Ilara was still staring at the screen, her mind racing. Whatever this was, it was big, bigger than the Icarni, perhaps even beyond them. The implications were terrifying, but one thing was certain. Humanity had just become a player in something much larger than themselves. "Ilara," Thorn said quietly, "what do we do now?" For the first time in what felt like ages, Ilara felt the familiar heavy weight of uncertainty settle over her. She had led them through the fire before, but this was different. A new force had entered the equation, one whose intentions were unclear but whose power was undeniable. And she knew, deep in her bones, that there was no turning back. "We fight," Ilara said finally, her voice unwavering. "We find out who these bastards are, and we make sure they know that humanity will not be intimidated, not by the Icarni, and certainly not by them." Thorn nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "Right behind you, Captain." As the enormous alien ship drew closer, its shimmering form filling the viewport, Ilara took one last look at the stars outside. The vastness of space had always been both awe-inspiring and terrifying, but now it was more than that. Now it was a battleground, and humanity was no longer just a small, insignificant species struggling to survive. They were a force to be reckoned with. And if these new enemies had any doubts about humanity's strength, Ilara would make sure they didn't for long. Stirred something ancient, something that was waiting. This war is far from over. In fact, it has only just begun. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Ilara was still staring at the screen, her mind racing. Whatever this was, it was big, bigger than the Akarni, perhaps even beyond them. The implications were terrifying, but one thing was certain. Humanity had just become a player in something much larger than themselves. Ilara, Thorn said quietly, what do we do now? For the first time in what felt like ages, Ilara felt the familiar heavy weight of uncertainty settle over her. She had led them through the fire before, but this was different. A new force had entered the equation, one whose intentions were unclear but whose power was undeniable. And she knew, deep in her bones, that there was no turning back. We fight, Ilara said finally, her voice unwavering. We find out who these bastards are, and we make sure they know that humanity will not be intimidated, not by the Akarni, and certainly not by them. Thorn nodded, his expression grim but resolute. Right behind you, Captain. As the enormous alien ship drew closer, its shimmering form filling the viewport, Ilara took one last look at the stars outside. The vastness of space had always been both awe-inspiring and terrifying, but now it was more than that. Now, it was a battleground. And humanity was no longer just a small, insignificant species struggling to survive. They were a force to be reckoned with. And if these new enemies had any doubts about humanity's strength, Ilara would make sure they didn't for long.